Hello, YouTube. I'm Vince White. I'm an employment attorney. On this channel, we generally answer publicly posted questions from YouTube users, getting folks the answers they need from an employment attorney. But not today because I had kind of an interesting conversation that I've never heard talked about before after 12, 13 years in this industry. And I thought maybe we ought to discuss it. So, I don't even know how to approach this. So, okay, in terms of disability discrimination, one of the things people are due under the Americans with Disabilities Act and a lot of state and local laws is called a reasonable accommodation, right? You have a disability, you need an accommodation so that you can successfully complete your job duties in the workplace, and that accommodation must then be reasonable for the employer to provide you, right? Um, and there's lots of examples. We have a lot of videos on what is and is not reasonable. It's probably not the place of this video to get into that. The video will be way too long. And I generally encourage folks to do best practices, have a conversation with their doctor about what accommodations they need and what would be, generally speaking, required for them to be successful in the workplace, and then think on their own about if that's reasonable for the employer to grant them or not. And obviously, you always want to push. You want to push the employer as much as possible, push the line in the sand that is viewed as reasonability, and get the accommodations for the employee. That's the goal on from our perspective, right? But a buddy of mine called me up today. He was like, "Hey, I need you to gut check me on this. I got a client calling me, and the client's got a disability that makes it. I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't want to identify anyone who's in any way involved in this. Client has a disability that makes it hard for them to read other human beings, read and understand other human beings. That presents a challenge for this person because of their disability." And so the client comes to my buddy with a list of accommodations that the client needs. My buddy's going through the accommodations, and he is looking at them, and some of them make a lot of sense, and some of them seem a little wild. And so he calls me up. He's like, "I need you to gut check me. Some of these accommodations in this case that this potential client wants me to take on, they don't really strike me as all that reasonable, or I don't know what to think." So we look at the accommodations and we're kind of going over them, and some of them are a little, they're big asks. They're big asks. I'll say that. I'm not saying they're not reasonable. I'm just saying they're big asks. And we're kind of going back and forth. We're going back and forth, and we involve a third friend in the conversation. And this friend, we're now like in a little group chat type of situation. And the third friend, who is not an employment attorney, says his 2 cents, which is, well, if you got a guy who can't read other human beings too well and has a tough time understanding other human beings on account of his disability, wouldn't he need an accommodation to know what is reasonable to other human beings? Blew my mind. I was sitting there. I was like, "Well, you can't get an accommodation to." Oh, yeah. No, you can get an accommodation to get an accommodation. I mean, yeah. How, how did I never think of this? Right? I mean, fundamentally, that person needs an accommodation to help them formulate their reasonable accommodations. Because that person may find it super challenging on account of their disability to know what their management and coworkers will view as reasonable. Because reasonability is a fairly complex standard, right? And it's not just tangibles, right? It's not just, well, you can buy this person a chair, it only costs $250, and that chair would be their accommodation. Those are simple. There's much more complex things in the world of accommodation that may or may not be viewed as reasonable, and there's a million and one factors in what goes into that reasonability standard, many of which seem to be governed by the complexities of human thought and emotion. And I'm not a doctor, not a medical professional, but if you're telling me that your diagnosis is of a disability that makes it difficult for you to read and understand other human beings, then the concept of asking for a reasonable accommodation and formulating that ask, that demand of what you need, boy, that seems daunting. Right? I mean, I can sit here and I can draw on a wealth of knowledge as to what is and is not reasonable based on my time in the workforce, but also my time litigating these things. But I'm not, listen, I've been accused, but I'm not currently suffering, to the best of my knowledge, from a disability, and I'm not making fun of this disability in any way, but I'm not dealing with a disability which makes it hard for me to read other humans. I'm not. People might think I'm indifferent to other humans, and that's a completely different thing. And that accusation may be true, but I'm not currently dealing with a disability that makes it difficult for me to read other humans. So I can base things on the wealth of experience I have over the course of my career, and I can use that information to extrapolate what could be viewed as reasonable and not reasonable when formulating my demand for an accommodation. But if you don't have the ability to do that, you don't have the ability to take in, digest, and aggregate that information, and the first accommodation you need would be someone to help you to formulate your reasonable accommodation ask, vis-a-vis what is and is not reasonable. I've never heard this discussed. Like, this is something a non-attorney, someone who's not an employment attorney, just said to me in casual passing in the tappa, well, don't they need something to help them with this? And I read it and I was like, yeah, of course. I mean, think about it. When you're new in the workforce, how many things do you not know? Right? Like, the first day in an office, we get free coffee. We can just take the coffee? What's the deal? And it's not like anybody stops by your office like, hey, there's a bar cart coming through for Wind Down Wednesdays. But there's like an unspoken rule. If you take more than one, you're definitely getting fired. Right? No, those conversations don't happen. People have to extrapolate. People have to judge based on social cues what is and is not viable in the workplace. We're not creating like checklists of things for people to know, because we're human beings and we don't deal with that disability, and we assume other people can extrapolate information the same way we can. And listen, that might not make that sense because a lot of new employees get in trouble. But even more importantly, if you're dealing with a disability that makes that process of extrapolating from the behavior of other humans difficult, then you're probably not going to succeed in that setting. So we should start, when it comes to these specific groups of disabilities where it's hard to read and understand other human beings for that person, we should probably start, first and foremost, with someone who can help that person to formulate these accommodation requests. They need their doctor, sure, absolutely. But their doctor's worried about their health. Their doctor's not worried about the reasonability standard. It is not, in fact, trained to deal with or contend with or formulate their demands based on a reasonability standard. That's not a thing. That's not part of med school, to the best of my knowledge. Employment attorneys do that, sure. But employment attorneys are expensive. So I think what I'm saying here is that a class of people might need to exist as contractors who can be brought in to advise employees with disabilities on how to formulate their reasonable accommodation requests. And supplying those people to employees would be an accommodation for employees who have trouble, because of their disability, formulating something along the lines of a reasonability standard. Now, I hope I've given voice to this in the correct way. I hope I've communicated it the way it is in my mind, the way it was in the conversation. I'm not sure I have. I'll be watching this video when it goes live, but this seems so basic. Like such a basic, like, oh, of course. But I've never heard it. I've never even heard it argued. And that seems terrible. Like, subscribe, comment down below if this was helpful. It would help me to help more people just like you. And remember, almost everybody works. Not everybody wins. Stay smart out there.